Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and this is the final video in our set review for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. We've already done each of the 5 colors and colorless. We're going to be going over multicolor here. This one is a doozy. There's a lot of multicolored cards. I think this is going to be the longest video, so we're going to try and get right to it. But before we do, make sure you like if you haven't already, because it helps the video so much. It helps me get it out to way more people, so I would appreciate that very greatly. It takes 2 seconds. Just hit the button. Also, subscribe if you're new, because I have a ton of content on the way. My top 10 and a bunch of brews that we're going to hit the ground running with as soon as it launches on Tuesday. Some crazy stuff lined up that you're not going to want to miss. So, with all of that said, let's get on to the cards. First up, we have 𝐴 the Unrepentant. Now, this was almost a pick for a favorite card. There's a couple cards in here that were very, very close to being my favorite card in multicolor, but there's just so many cards in multicolor that it's kind of hard. But 𝐴 the Unrepentant, 5/5 legendary Scorpion Dragon Rogue for 4 mana in the colors of Rakdos. Has flying and trample, and you can sacrifice 3 other creatures. If you do, you put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, but you can only activate that ability as a sorcery and only once each turn. It would be kind of busted if you could use it multiple times, to be completely honest, and it would also be busted if you could do it at instant speed in the middle of combat or whatever. But even just a 5/5 flying trample for 4 mana is really, really good. So the fact that you can sack like 3 little creature tokens to get a big creature into play could be pretty gnarly on top of that. Now, I do feel like the kind of deck to support a creature like this is very niche. You need to be able to go really wide with creature tokens that you don't mind sacrificing, but then also have really big bombs to put into play. And those 2 things don't normally cross-synergize into the same deck, but lucky for you, there is a deck up on the channel right now that I'm really excited to upgrade with this card and a few others that does exactly that. So if you're interested in a deck that goes super wide and then can just cheat out a few bombs, we've already got something that does that. It's called Rip or Not. Check out the channel, check out my deck text for that one, because we're already doing it, and this is going to do it even harder. So this will definitely be included there, and it's a really cool card. The most important thing to note about this, though, is like 5/5 flying trample is fine by itself, so don't get hung up on the ability thinking that this won't see play in enough decks because it's hard to make that ability work, because even just the body is amazing, and just on the off chance that maybe you can use the ability, it's a nice little bit of gravy even if you're not built around it. Next up, we have Annie Flash the Veteran. Talk about value. 4/5 legendary human rogue with flash, 1 white, 1 green, 1 red, and 3. So she's in the colors of Naya. When she enters the battlefield, if you cast it, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And whenever any flash becomes tapped, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. She does a lot. She seems like she's too much mana. It seems like 6 drops just are too much to really see play in standard, unless they're the top end of your ramp deck, right? But when you really think about how much value she gets you, there might be a place for her, maybe even in the legendary Legend Matters decks. Because you play her in combat when your opponent swings at you, right? She comes in as a 4/5 at instant speed, blocks and eats their 4/4 dude. So you're already getting 2-for-1 card advantage there, right? But then it also brings a permanent card with mana value 3 or less back. Maybe one of your 3-drop legends or something like that. So that's a 3-for-1. And then because you did it at instant speed in combat, there's a decent chance that they're tapped out, that they spent all of their mana before going to combat, which means they can't kill her, and you get to just untap and immediately swing in with a 4/5. That's also going to exile the top 2 that you can play immediately. So 3-for-1, potentially 5-for-1. That can get you even more card advantage over the course of the game if they don't find a way to stop it, because every single time it becomes tapped, it's going to exile cards. She's also really good at crewing or saddling mounts or vehicles, because just becoming tapped is going to let you exile those 2 cards to play. So you don't even need to swing with her, right? You can tap her other ways, and those are really good options. So the potential for this card is kind of through the roof. I don't know exactly what deck wants it, but whatever deck wants it, they're going to be pretty happy with the absolute slam dunk in value you get out of Annie. Next up, we have Annie Joins Up, Speak of the Devil. 4 mana for a legendary enchantment in the colors of Naya. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage to any creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, which is a very important part of this card. And then as long as it sits on the battlefield, if a triggered ability of a legendary creature you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So this is like kind of a roaming throne for legendaries for the same amount of mana. The big difference is you're not getting a 4/4 body, but you're also dealing 5 damage to something. So it's like you're not getting more board presence, but you're taking away their board presence. So it kind of evens out. And then the big upside on this is just the fact that it's a lot harder to deal with. It's a lot harder to remove because it's an enchantment. It's not a creature. So I think being able to just kill a Sheoldred when this enters the battlefield is going to be nuts. So if you're in a legendary deck that specifically has a lot of triggered abilities, this could be nuts. Maybe 5-color legends with 𝐷𝑒𝑣𝑃 would be kind of wild, right? Being able to double trigger 𝐷𝑒𝑣𝑃's ability seems pretty good. So I don't know, maybe there's a deck like that. This also seems really good with Joda. Oh my god, why am I drawing a blank? I know this card. Let me know in the comments. It's one of those. I think it's Joda. Yeah, it's Joda. It's Joda. So this is going to be really good with that, right? Getting double triggers off that would be pretty gnarly. So this card is really good, but it has to find just the right home. Next up, we have Assimilation Angus. And this is actually my favorite card for multicolor in this set. This is 3 mana in the colors of Azorius for an artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target creature until Assimilation Angus leaves the battlefield. Apparently, even the dog is excited. And then whenever it becomes attached to a creature, for as long as it remains attached to it, that creature becomes a copy of whatever creature card that you exiled with the Assimilation Angus. So this is a 3 mana exile removal for any creature. Full stop. That alone's going to be really good as an artifact, right? It's not necessarily above rate or anything, but it's pretty much on rate with what you expect for exile removal. So the fact that you just have this free ability to just pay to and equip this to one of your little dorks and turn them into a copy of whatever it is you exiled is just insane gravy, in my opinion, and super fun. Most of the time, you're going to be hitting their best creature when you play this, get their best threat off the field. So then if, like, no matter what, your worst guy can become a copy of that best guy that you exiled of theirs, and even if they kill that creature, you just equip it to something else and keep doing it. Imagine just they play Sheoldred, you Angus it, no more Sheoldred, and now I can just keep turning my dude into Sheoldred no matter how many times you kill my dude. Like, that seems crazy. I just think this card is awesome. But even beyond that, there's a lot of really cool equipment tribal and equipment synergies that have been released over the last few years. Like, Wizards have been really trying to make equipment tribal a deck type in standard, and it's just never enough. Every set we get a little more support, and it's still not enough. But now we have Assimilation Angus. So all of those things that could, like, search up equipments or reduce the cost of equipments, all of that stuff now, it lets you play the Assimilation Angus, right? If you search your library for an equipment, you can search for Assimilation Angus, which means you could search up removal. You can now use all of those things that search up equipments to find removal, which you could never really do before. So being able to, like, add that into the equation, we might finally be at a point where an equipment deck is actually a real thing. And if it is, it's probably going to be Jeskai, but we'll definitely experiment with it as soon as the set comes out, and if it seems to be a real thing, that deck tech will make an appearance on the channel for sure. But this is my pick for my favorite multicolor card in the set. Next up, we have At Knife Point. 3 mana for an enchantment in the colors of Rakdos. As long as it's your turn, outlaws you control have first strike. That's going to be huge, because your first gut instinct is to think of outlaws the same way you think as any creature type, but it's not. It's 5 creature types. You got to remember that. So anything that affects outlaws is in some ways 5 times more effective than something that would just affect one creature type in the same way, right? You're going to have way more options for things that can utilize it, take advantage of it, and potentially break it. So being able to give all of your outlaws first strike is awesome. In an outlaw deck, this is going to be great. It's going to be awesome in limited. I think it's a pretty high pick. Might even just push you into Rakdos outlaws if you get it quick enough, because all of your outlaws having first strike on the swing is just nuts. But it doesn't stop there, because whenever you commit a crime, you also get to make another outlaw, a 1/1 mercenary that can tap to give something +1 attack at sorcery speed. And it's really easy to commit crimes. If there's one thing we learned from early access, it's committing crimes is super easy. A lot of times you can do it for no mana. A lot of times you're just doing it when you're doing the thing you would want to be doing anyway, like just playing a removal spell to kill their creature you need to kill, and you're like, oh yeah, that also triggers a crime, doesn't it? And I get free value. So being able to flood the board with 1/1s almost makes up for the cost of this enchantment itself, and the fact that all of them are getting first strike, and all the mercenaries can then buff up whatever creatures they need to that have the first strike, so that their power becomes the point you need it to for the first strike to become relevant. It all just synergizes together into insanity. So I think this is like one of the best cards you can get super early in a draft if you're going super deep into Outlaw Tribal. It's definitely like a signpost pick, and it's going to put you in Outlaw Tribal probably, because I really feel like it's that good. So don't let this one slip under the radar. Next up, we have Badlands Revival, 5 mana in the colors of Golgari for a sorcery. Return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, but also return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. This is just gas. I can't believe this is an uncommon, to be honest. Like, 5 mana reanimate a dude is standard. That's the going rate, at least for standard playable reanimation spells, right? So the fact that you just get another thing to your hand, whatever permanent you want, just like for free kind of, is pretty insane when you take into account the fact that this is just an uncommon, right? It's not like a rare. It's not like it's a super pushed like tentpole rare of the set or anything like that. It's just another uncommon. So I think this card is awesome. It's going to want to be in just the right deck in limited, but even if it's not in that deck, it's still a decent amount of value, getting 2 things back for 5 mana, and one of them is going straight to the battlefield. So I don't think this is a super high pick in limited, but it's definitely going to be relatively up there. And then there's potential for this in constructed too. If reanimator decks are a thing, they're going to want to strongly consider this card, I think. More important than that, though, there's a lot of new graveyard hate coming into the environment, so I don't even know if those decks can be able to exist. But if they do, this card's in contention. Next up, we have Baron Bertram Greywater, 4 mana, 3/4 legendary vampire noble in the colors of Orzhov. You can pay a black and 1 and sack another creature or artifact to draw a card. Nice little bit of a mana sink there for value. But whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, you create a 1/1 black vampire rogue creature token that has lifelink. So not only is it a 1/1 lifelinker, but keep in mind, this is an outlaw. This is a way to make outlaw tokens and double up your outlaw tokens in a pretty easy, non-committal way as far as how much mana you need to pump into it. Granted, this ability can only trigger once a turn, but if you're already in kind of like an outlaw tribal deck, and you have a way of making mercenary tokens, every time you make a mercenary token, you're going to get another outlaw token here that has lifelink, which is pretty awesome, and then your mercenary tokens can make the lifelinking tokens bigger so that you gain more life. It just seems like there's a lot of potential for this. Granted, he doesn't count as an outlaw himself, but in just the right deck, I think this guy is going to be really strong and limited. You're probably going to want to pick him relatively high, and it's probably going to push you into a very specific archetype, but at the same time, I don't think it's like a super high pick. I don't think it's pack 1, pick 1, or anything like that. You need to know that you're going to be in that deck pretty deep for this to be good. Not to be good. Like, having the ability to sack creatures and artifacts to draw cards is always going to be kind of good, right? So I think this is even playable in decks that aren't super deep in it. But if you are super deep in it, you're going to need to grab it somewhat early, because I don't expect a card like this to table very often. Next up, we have Bonnie Paul Clearcutter. 6/5 legendary giant scout with reach for 6 mana in the colors of Simic. When she enters the battlefield, you create Bo, which is the name of one of my puppers, and I'm very happy about that. It is a legendary blue Ox creature token with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, which is important because being worded that way, it's going to scale. As you play more lands, that creature is going to get bigger and bigger, which is really important. Whenever you attack, draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield. Now, when I first saw this card, I was on the fence. It gives you a lot of value, but it's also kind of expensive. And when you get to that point where you're at the 6 or 7 mana level, like, there's very few cards that are gonna be good enough to be your payoff in, like, your ramp deck or whatever. Does this make the cut? But then I realized it's whenever you attack, you draw a card and ramp a land, not whenever Bonnie Paul attacks. So that means the turn you play Bonnie Paul, you get to attack with any other creature and trigger it, draw a card, and ramp a land onto the battlefield. So that land comes onto the battlefield untapped. It doesn't come tapped unless the land itself has to come into the battlefield tapped, but you get to play it untapped. So in a way, Bonnie Paul kind of feels like a 5-drop because you're getting 1 mana back that same turn, but you're also drawing a card, and then you're able to use her every single turn to draw cards and ramp out lands, and you don't even have to attack with her. She could just stay back and be your big blocker. She has reach. Bo can be swinging in, or other creatures can be swinging in. You could be drawing cards and ramping every single turn. So the fact that you can trigger her, draw, ramp, the turn she comes into play, while holding her and Bo up as blockers, and then get extra value every turn after that, it's just, that's what puts it over the top, and I think this card might be in contention for one of, like, the top end picks for a sort of ramp deck. That being said, you do want to be in a deck that's going to be able to attack the turn that you drop this, so that's worth noting. You want to be at least wide enough with creatures that you can make that happen. So keep that in mind. Next up, we have Breaches the Blastmaker. 3 mana for a 3/3 legendary goblin pirate with menace in the colors of Izzet. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you can sack an artifact. If you do, you flip a coin. If you win the flip, you get to copy the spell that you cast, and if you lose the flip, it deals damage equal to the spell's mana value to any target. So this is a coin flip that's win-win for you. You're either getting double spell the first time the second time you cast a spell. You're either getting a double spell if you can sack an artifact, or you get to just dome them with a bunch of damage. So either way, it's going to be pretty good. I think this is going to be best in a deck where you have bigger instants or sorceries where you can get more value off of that ability, but you also need to be able to second spell. So it's very tricky building around this just right, but I think there's got to be potential there to make it work, right? I'm not 100% sure exactly what I'd use it in. You'd want to play something like an Opt first, so the rest of your mana can be left over to make sure you play a big thing that you can either copy or do a bunch of damage. So if you guys have ideas about the perfect deck to build around this guy, or that this guy can slot into, that we can get the most value out of that, definitely let me know in a comment, because the potential's there. But off the top of my head, I'm not really sure the absolute best way to use him. Next up, we have Bruised Taro Roving Rancher. This is a 4/3 legendary human warrior for 4 mana in the colors of Boros. Gives all oxen you control double strike, and whenever he enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile the top card of your library. If it's a land, you get to make a 2/2 ox. Otherwise, you get to cast the thing that you exiled until the end of your next turn. And that's important. Even if you don't have the mana left over this turn and you can't cast it, you can just wait until your next turn and then play it, and then do the thing again. So sheer value there because of that. Like, you can safely play this on turn 4 and not worry about not having any mana up to play the thing, which is awesome. So I don't know if playing the other oxes is good enough. If any of the other oxen are decent statted, good, on curve plays, maybe you could see the start of an oxen tribal deck. But even just giving the tokens that it makes double strike also seems maybe like it's okay enough, but I'm not sure. On a side note, playing this with changelings seems kind of gross. So you could do that, but it's hard to evaluate this card outside of that, so we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Cactus Folkshot, a 4/4 plant mercenary with reach and ward 2 for 4 mana in the colors of Gruul. At the beginning of combat on your turn, other creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain trample and haste until end of turn. This seems kind of insane. First of all, it's just a really good on curve play, right? 4/4 reach ward 2 for 4 is great by itself. But the fact that all of your power 4 or greater creatures are going to get trample and haste as well seems pretty pushed for an uncommon, to be completely honest. Now, there's a couple things that are easy to overlook here. First of all, it's a mercenary, so it's going to be an outlaw tribal. Even though it's a plant, you might fixate on that. Don't overlook the fact that it's a mercenary, so it's an outlaw, and it's going to capitalize on all of those outlaw synergies, and that just makes this even better. But then, like I said, it's a plant too, so you can put this in something like Insidious Roots, and if you can just completely go off in a turn with Insidious Roots, not only are you getting all your plant tokens and buffing them all up with a bunch of +1/+1 counters so that you get like a huge army in one turn, which is kind of what the Insidious Roots deck is already doing. But if you have this guy down, all of the ones that are big enough to be 4 power or more, which is going to be most of them, now they get trample and haste. Now you don't have to wait a turn to swing in for the Alpha Strike and win, right? Which is normally the problem Insidious Roots has. It goes super wide with all these big plant tokens, says go, and then has to worry about crossing their fingers and hoping they survive the turn cycle so that they can attack with them the next turn and win. If you happen to have this guy, you can just do it right away. And I don't know if that means he's actually worth a slot in that deck, because that deck goes off so quick, that 4 mana, just, I don't know. But then again, the plants can tap to make mana, right? So, should be a lot easier to get him out regardless. I think it's definitely worth exploring at least, but we'll have to try it out to see if it's actually a thing that's worth doing. That being said, in Limited, this is a very high pick. You're going to want to slam dunk this thing because it is not coming back. Even without going super deep into any kind of synergies that it has, it's just a great card by itself for an uncommon, so play it. Next up, we have Congregation Griff. This one's a little bit underestimated, I think. This is a 1/4 Hippogriff mount with flying and lifelink for 3 mana in the colors of Selesnya. Whenever it attacks while saddled, it gets +X/+X until end of turn. My dog is very excited about this one, where X is the number of mounts you control. It also saddles for 3, so you do need to tap a 3 power creature or some combination of creatures totaling 3 power or more in order for this to become saddled, which is kind of a lot for a 1/4 flying lifelinker, right? But what's worth noting is it doesn't say other mounts you control. So even if this is your only mount, if you saddle it, it will still swing as a 2/5 flying lifelink, which is not nothing. Even just holding back a 1/4 flying lifelink as a blocker for 3 mana is pretty good. So I think this card's a little bit better than people give it credit for. Like, you can slam this on 3, hold off aggro all day. It doesn't matter if it's in the air or on the ground. You're probably blocking it unless they get to the point where they have 4 power or more creatures, which is not happening super early in the curve. And whatever you block, you're gaining at least that 1 life back, right? So even if they then have a 4 power creature and they're swinging in with like 2 2/2s and they're 4/4, you can block 1 2/2 and gain 1 life back to help mitigate some of the damage that the 4/4 is dealing. So I just think this is a really good defensive play that then later in the game, if you happen to get a couple mounts down, well, now it's really easy to just like take some of your creatures that are less than stellar, that maybe can't swing or block effectively, and just saddle the thing and swing in for damage and gain way more life just by having a couple more mounts out. So if you're in Mount Tribal, this is a really good way of holding off aggro until you start to get all your pieces into play. And even outside of Mount Tribal, I think this is a relatively decent pick if you're trying to just play kind of defensively and hold off aggro long enough to set up the things that you're doing. So don't let this one go under your radar. Next up, we have Doc Orlock, Grizzled Genius. This was almost my pick for best limited card until I started to really think a lot deeper about the play patterns with it. And I think this is going to be better in constructed than in limited. It's still going to be good in limited though. 2/3 Legendary Bear Druid for 2 mana in the colors of Simic. Spells you cast from your graveyard or from exile cost 2 less to cast. Plotting cards from your hand cost 2 less to cast. So the main thing here is you play this on 2. Every single card that has plot requires at least 1 mana of a specific color. So you're never going to be able to jam Doc Orlock on 2 and immediately like plot something for free or anything like that. So it's not like insane on curve. You can't use it the turn it comes down. And I think that combined with the fact that there aren't nearly as many ways in this set of playing cards from exile that require mana, so that first ability isn't going to be nearly as useful in limited as it's going to be in constructed. So those two things kind of are what dropped it down just a little bit. That being said, it's still a really good card for limited. Like, if you're deep into plot, after this guy comes out and then you untap, like, all of the cards you plot cost 2 less. On turn 3, you could have 3 cards in your hand that each plot for 3 mana, and you could plot each of them for 1 mana. Plot 3 cards in 1 turn. And then your turn 4 is absolutely insane. And he's a 2/3, so even though you're losing out on a little bit of tempo, and in order to plot a lot of cards, like, you still have a guy down that can block, right? That can hold off a little bit of the aggro, because it's a halfway decent body for the 2 mana. But what's also worth noting is you could block after you play this, and then on turn 3, you could plot your 3 cards or whatever, and then the next turn they could attack with like a 4 or 5 power creature, and you could just chump block with this, just to like keep your life total high and stay alive, and you still have all of those cards plotted. Like, you already kind of got your value, so your next turn is going to be still super explosive. So worst case scenario, even if you kind of have to chump block something really big with this guy to make up for your tempo loss and falling behind, it's kind of worth it if you end up just vomiting 4 mana worth and 3 plot cards all in the same turn the next turn, and just go insanely big on your board presence. So don't let this one sleep. I say that about a lot of cards, don't I? Don't sleep on this one. But I mean, I really mean it. The cards in this set are just crazy, especially some of these multicolor uncommons for limited. So this could be pretty decent in limited. Not going to be my pick for limited because of the reasons I stated earlier, but in constructed, I think this has real contention too, because in constructed, not only can you do all of that crazy stuff, but you can also do stuff like play your adventures from exile and pay 2 less for each of them because of the first ability. And that's just a way to put this card really over the top in standard. So I'm super excited to pair this with some of the exile matters, like you get value off playing stuff from exile archetypes that already exist within standard. It's going to be really fun to brew. Next up, we have Ariette the Beguiler. This is another card that was almost my favorite, specifically because she's going to be my favorite to build for Brawl for Community Night. If any of you guys have been to my Community Nights on Twitch, every Thursday we have Community Night, where I just spend the whole night playing games against whoever is in chat, all of you guys. And it's awesome. And whenever we hit our weekly sub goal, it becomes a crack-a-pack night so that everyone that beats me wins packs of Magic cards, and it gets crazy. But one of the formats people every now and then like to challenge me to over there is Brawl. And I only have a few Brawl decks because normally I'm not like that excited about building Brawl. But this card, this is going to be the first time I've ever on launch day been excited and made sure I built a new Brawl deck, because this is going to be wild. So this is a 4/4 legendary human warlock with lifelink in the colors of Esper for 4 mana. Whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to that aura's mana value, you gain control of that permanent for as long as that aura is attached to it. This card's insane. Now, on first glance, it's very easy to evaluate this card based on the fact that, like, oh, you can only really steal their small stuff. Like, how big can your auras possibly be, right? And if they are that big, how efficient is it going to be to even cast a super expensive aura so that you can steal their bomb or whatever? And that's kind of the way I was starting to evaluate it at first too. But then you start to realize, like, no, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to steal their bombs, right? The sheer value and tempo gain you get from every single aura taking their board presence away and contributing to yours. Like, automatic 2-for-1, not even counting what the aura does itself. Then you start to realize, like, who cares if I don't take their bombs? I take the rest of their board. They're left with almost nothing. My board's like double the size. That could be just insane. So playing her as a commander seems awesome. But even in Standard, I think there might be a place for her. And one way in particular I'm excited to use her is maybe in a deck that uses all of the old spirits that have Disturb. I know they're going to rotate in a few months out of Standard, but those cards in particular are a good way to kind of still be able to curve out with creatures and keep up with your opponent by playing those spirits. And then when they die, they can come back as auras, which is a really good way of not only having extra auras to steal stuff after Ariette is out, but some of those auras are relatively expensive, more expensive than you'd probably be willing to pay if it was just an aura for that without being the Disturb, you know? So I don't know, maybe being able to grab stuff on the backside after disturbing some auras from your graveyard could be cool too. I'm excited to experiment with her. It's going to be fun. That Brawl deck's coming for sure. I like her. Next up we have Eartha Joe, Frontier Mentor. This is 4 mana for a 2/4 legendary core advisor in the colors of Boros. When she enters, you get a 1/1 mercenary token that can tap to give something +1/+0 until end of turn at sorcery speed. But also, whenever you activate an ability that targets a creature or player, you get to copy that ability, and you may choose new targets for the copy. This works for literally any activated ability that targets. So, there's a lot of crazy stuff you could potentially do with her. In Limited, even just all of your mercenaries, right? Being able to double their activations, basically give +2/+0 instead of +1/+1. But it doesn't even have to be +2/+0. It's still +1/+0 2 separate times, so you can target 2 different creatures with the double. And that, even that alone, if you're going deep into mercenaries and making a lot of mercenary tokens, could be pretty nutty. But the fact that you could get even more value off of other activated abilities also makes her pretty crazy, and she even just comes with another body. Even just 3/5 worth of power toughness across 2 bodies for 4 mana as an uncommon, with all of this upside, seems pretty gas. So I think she's going to be another one of those like signpost sort of uncommon picks to push you into an archetype. I think she's going to be really good in Limited. And hopefully there's some kind of a crazy way we can use her in Constructed, because every time there's a card that lets us double up on activated or triggered abilities or what have you, there's usually a way to completely abuse that in Standard. I haven't completely thought through exactly the best ways to utilize this specific card, but if you've got ideas about that, let me know in the comments. Next up, we've got Form a Posse, a sorcery for 2 mana and X in the colors of Boros. Create X 1/1 red mercenary creature tokens that can tap to give something +1/+0 at sorcery speed. This is another card that slots really well into the same archetype that last card did. It's going to make you go wide with mercenaries, so if you have extra ways to get more value out of those mercenaries, whether you're in Sacrifice Tribal, or if you're in Outlaw Tribal, or if you have something like Eartha Joe that can double their tap triggers, lots of really good ways to utilize a bunch of token creatures. Maybe Mardu might be the best home for this. I think this is going to be a relatively high pick in Limited if you're going for any of those archetypes. In Constructed, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think the one place this could see play, if it sees play anywhere, would be in some kind of a crazy new Outlaw Sacrifice Aristocrat style brew, which I am pretty confident exists. I think there's like some kind of a Mardu Aristocrats specifically focused on Outlaws. We've got that new Bastion of Remembrance style card that only triggers on Outlaws. So that could be a thing. I'm going to explore it. If it is, It'll be a deck tech on the channel. We'll see. I think it'll be fun. Next up, we have Gearred, Mirror of the Wilds. 3 mana for a 3/3 legendary human shaman with haste in the colors of Naya. Non-token creatures you control can tap to make a token that's a copy of target token you control that entered the battlefield this turn. So, I think what helps put this card over the top a little bit is the fact that it has haste and it can use its own ability, right? It says non-token creatures have, not other non-token creatures have. So, you can immediately play this for 3, tap it to make a copy of your best token that entered that turn. Now, you gotta have very specific ways of making sure tokens come into play on the turns that you want so that you can make the copies on that turn, and that's gonna be the tricky part. But there's plenty of busted ways to make tokens right now in Standard, so I'd be very surprised if there isn't some kind of a crazy go-wide token deck that Gearred just turns up to 11 in Standard. If you know exactly where this would slot in, let me know in the comments, but the potential is there. That deck's gotta exist. It's gotta. Next up, we have Honest Rutstein. This is actually my pick for the best limited card in the set, at least for multicolor, right? 3 mana for a 3/2 legendary human warlock in the colors of Golgari. When he enters the battlefield, you get to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And while he's on the battlefield, creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This guy is just insane gas. This is probably the best uncommon we've seen in a long time. This is going to be good enough for constructed play. Being able to reduce the cost of every single creature spell by 1 means you just have so much gas moving into turn 4 and later. You're going to be able to double cast creatures on turns where you normally only be able to cast 1. And all of this is on a 3 power creature for 3 mana, which is nuts because we used to have like Gravedigger that would bring a creature back to your hand, and that cost 4 mana, not 3, and that was a 2/2, not a 3/2. So we have a relevant power creature that can get in there for damage, can trade if you absolutely need to. It's giving you automatic 2 for 1 by getting something back the turn it comes into play, and it's reducing the cost of literally every creature you cast for the rest of the game by 1, which means on turn 4 you could cast 2 3-drops. Just nutty. This card is just crazy. It's gonna see play in Constructed. I don't know exactly where yet, maybe everywhere. But also, you want to snag it very high and limited. If this gets passed to you, grab it, go Golgari, because it's very, very strong. It's not going to table. It will never table. Not ever. Don't expect it to. But this is my pick for best limited card in multicolor. Next up, we have Intimidation Campaign. Now, this is 3 mana in the colors of Dimir for an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life and draw a card. Whenever you commit a crime, you get to return Intimidation Campaign to its owner's hand. So, this is a lot like... what was that card called? There was another campaign. I know the name of it, but for some reason I can't recall it right now. But Disinformation Campaign, right? Yes, Disinformation Campaign. This is a lot like Disinformation Campaign. This doesn't give you as much value every time you play it as Disinformation Campaign. But the thing you need to take into account with this card is it's way, way, way easier to commit a crime and get this back into your hand than it is to surveil, which is how you would get Disinformation Campaign back to your hand. It was every time you surveil. So even though this doesn't give you as much value on each cast, it's going to be way easier to just keep recasting it, keep recasting it, keep recasting it without having to jump through surveil hoops, right? The rest of your deck can be way higher quality cards that don't need to be devoted to, you know, a niche sort of keyword ability like Surveil in order to get your value off this card. You just need to commit crimes. That's any removal spell, anything that targets the opponent, any counterspell, any discard, anything at all that targets the opponent or their stuff, even in their graveyard, will just bring this back to your hand. So being able to drain for 1 and draw a card every single time that happens seems pretty nutty. Maybe playing it in an Enchantment Matters deck with something like Hollowed Haunting, so you can repeatedly trigger the Hollowed Haunting. That seems really cool. There's going to be a lot of different ways to brew with this card, and I'm excited to do that. In Limited, I think this is almost kind of a sleeper. It's not my pick for the sleeper in multicolor in this set, but In Limited, it is kind of a sleeper because I feel like people don't realize yet how easy it is going to be to commit crimes. And there's so much more room, so much more time in the Limited archetype to, or in the Limited format to like kind of take your time a little bit more and get all of the value out of every card by spending a little bit more mana than you otherwise would be able to in like a constructed format. So I think, you know, going deep into the Commit a Crime deck, this is going to be a way for you to just gas up every turn and just overwhelm the opponent with value to where they can't keep up. So keep that in mind. That being said, you do want to be deep into crimes in order to get the most out of this, so it doesn't just slot into anything. So be careful that you're in the right archetype. The dogs agree. The dogs agree. Next up, we have Gem Lightfoot Sky Explorer. 4 mana for a 3/3 legendary human scout with flying and vigilance. This was almost my pick for best limited. This card is really good. So 4 mana in the colors of Azorius for a 3/3 flying vigilance. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, draw a card. So the absolute floor on this is you get a 3/3 flying vigilance for 4. I know that's the third time I've said that. I need to stop repeating myself. Bad habit. But then also when you're out of gas and you have nothing to play, normally in Limited that can be a thing and you're just like, you don't get anything. Well, now you get to draw a card at the end of turn, right? That's the absolute floor. But it gets better from there because the Azorius archetype kind of pivots into 2 different directions, right? You can go into plot really heavily, where you're plotting cards every turn and then casting them for free the next turn. And if you're doing that, you're never casting a spell from your hand if you're doing, you know, plot with all of your cards. So you can trigger this a bunch of different turns just by how you sequence your plotting and playing things from exile with plot instead of playing anything from your hand. And then you also have Azorius kind of pushing in a direction with flash, a lot of flash cards. So if you have a lot of flash cards, you can just wait until your opponent's turn to flash things in so that you're not casting anything from your hand that turn. And that's another way to draw cards off this. So the floor being that you're drawing cards when you're out of gas on an already relevant body in the air with vigilance for only 4 mana is already pretty good. But the fact that the ceiling can only get better from there and you can get value off of some of the important keywords and archetypes within the set just makes this card really, really good. So it's going to be a high pick. You probably want to snag it and start moving in the direction of one of those 2 archetypes if you see this early. It will not come back to you, it will not table, and it is going to be that good. Next up, we have Jolene Plundering Pugilist. 3 mana for a 4/2 legendary human mercenary. Whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures with power 4 or greater, you create a treasure token, and you can pay 2 mana and sack a treasure token to deal 1 damage to any target. So a couple things worth noting here. First of all, the treasure token can be tapped and it doesn't matter. You can still sack it to Jolene to ping something. So there are a number of cards in this set that create tapped treasure tokens, and this sort of an ability with that makes those treasures a little bit more valuable than they otherwise would. But just anytime you attack with a creature with power 4 or greater, getting a treasure token is going to be kind of wild. She can trigger herself, but she can also just come down, and if you already have a 4 power creature on the field the turn she comes down, you can immediately swing with that other creature and get a treasure token. So over the course of the game, she can provide a reasonable amount of value. She's an above rate, at least in power, statted creature for the 3 mana, and also counts as an outlaw, which is going to be hugely important in this set. So she's kind of got everything going for her. Obviously, the wider you can go with treasures, the better off you're going to be. The more you can be in the power 4 or greater archetype, the better she's going to be. But even outside of those, she's a pretty decent addition to any kind of rule deck. Next up, we have Combo, Profiteering Mayor. 3 mana for a 2/4 legendary human advisor in the colors of Orzhov. Whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your opponent's control, for each of them, you make a tap token that's a copy of it. This ability triggers only once each turn, and then whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So this is a token tribal card, support for token tribal, that's also sideboard hate for token tribal. I don't know if it's actually good enough to be worth actually using as a sideboard card in Constructed. That's going to take a little bit of testing, but the idea that every single token you make, I get 2, And then also when those tokens enter the battlefield, I get to drain you for 1, is crazy. If I'm making a bunch of tokens, I'm draining you. If you're making a bunch of tokens, I'm draining you, and I'm getting those tokens as well. Just seems like if you're in the right deck, this could be awesome to begin with, but if you're in the right deck and against the right deck, this could be absolutely insane. It's also pretty good in limited because it's a nice way to stave off any kind of mercenary style deck that's trying to go wide with mercenary tokens, because you just keep rate with all of their mercenaries, which is awesome, while draining life. So obviously a slam dunk in limited, but it's a rare, so that's expected. I really want to brew some kind of a crazy token aristocrats deck around this guy, because the potential for him to just completely go off is kind of nuts. And unlike most aristocrats payoffs, you don't need to lose the thing to drain for 1, right? You drain for 1 when you get the thing, so you don't even have to be in a sacrifice deck. You just need to be in a deck that goes super wide, which is a little bit easier of a constraint to meet. So it's going to be really interesting brewing around this guy. I'm excited to see what he can do. We'll see. Next up, we have Kellen Joins Up. 3 mana for a legendary enchantment. This is another one that I really, really like. When it enters the battlefield, in the colors of Bant, by the way. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand. If you do, it becomes plotted. And then whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So not only is it legendary tribal support, it's going to buff up all your dudes like crazy the more legends that you're playing, but it kind of replaces itself when you play it. It's 3 mana itself, and it grabs any 3 mana thing from your hand and plots it, so you get to play it for free next turn. So I love that it just replaces itself. You get just sheer automatic value. It's almost like getting a free legendary enchantment that's going to make all of your legendary creatures get bigger and bigger and bigger as you're playing them, which I kind of love. But there's also some interesting ways to sort of abuse plotting cards that don't naturally have plot. Like this plotting something with mana value 3. I've already brought this up when we were going over Jason, the blue cards. But you can do things like plot an adventure creature. You know, you could plot like a Bramble Familiar because it costs 3 or less. It's a 2-drop. But then you can play it from exile as a plotted card for free as the adventure side, which lets you just play any huge thing. So Kellen Joins Up is a cool way to sort of like break that kind of dynamic. And then you also could have things like Rush of Dread, which is a red black spree card for 3 mana that does some really crazy things like make you sack half creatures, make you discard half your cards, make you lose half your life for extra amounts of colorless mana that you pay. So you could do something like plot that with this, and then you can play it for free next turn, not have to pay that initial 3 mana, so that you have enough mana left over to select way more of those than you normally would. Or you could just like pay 1 mana, make them sack their board or whatever. Like, you can do really, really crazy above rate things because you're basically getting a 3 mana cost reduction on that spell. So some really crazy stuff you could do. I don't know if you specifically want to do that in a legendary tribal deck. I don't know if maybe this card is worth it to free cast things like that regardless of the static ability. But there's a lot of potential here in a lot of different ways. So it'll be interesting to brew around for sure. And next up we have Kellen the Kid himself. And this is actually my pick for second best runner-up multicolor card in the set. This is a 3/3 flying lifelink legendary human fairy rogue. For 3 mana in the colors of Bant, whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, you may cast a permanent spell with equal or lesser mana value from your hand without paying its mana cost. If you don't, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, when you plot a card, it still has the mana cost, the mana value of whatever's printed on the card. It's just you get to play it for free the next turn, right? So playing anything that you've plotted, you could get some really crazy stuff to go off. Like if you manage to plot like a 5-drop for 3 mana, and then the next turn you're playing it for free, it still counts as playing a 5-drop from exile, and you can get another 5-drop from your hand for free. That just seems bananas. But then you take into account the fact that you can use this with adventures. Every time you play an adventure creature from exile, you get another permanent that's the same size as it from your hand for free. You just get to double up all of those adventure stuff, which is also kind of bananas. And that's not even counting the other ways that you can cast stuff from exile that this could potentially synergize with. So I just think the sheer value that this provides is absolutely overwhelming and insane with either plot or adventures. But then on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, it's not like that ability is coming on a not great creature, right? Sometimes we've seen really, really good abilities on less than stellar creatures, like Loot, that we'll talk about when we get there in a little bit. But no, this is a 3/3 flying life-linking body for 3, which is a completely legitimate, halfway decent, more than halfway decent, like a really good on-rate creature, regardless of the ability. It counts as human tribal, it counts as outlaw tribal. It's just good. This is just a really good card. It doesn't quite make my pick for best, but it is my runner-up for sure. It is such an insane card. There's going to be so many ways to brew around it. You guys will see once people finally start to unlock the true potential of this, just how insane the board state can get because of this card. Next up, we have Chrom, Violent Cacophony. 4 mana for a 2/3 legendary zombie horror with flying in the colors of Izzet. And whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on Chrom and draw a card. This card is not usable and constructed in any way whatsoever. It is too expensive, especially for Izzet. But in Limited, this card's actually really good. Keep in mind this counts as a zombie. There are some zombie synergies like Geralf and stuff like that floating around in this set that this can synergize with. But also, the double spell thing is going to be pretty easy to pull off, especially with plot around. You know, being able to cast one spell for free because you plotted it the turn prior, pretty easy to trigger this ability. So if you have this flying thing that can get bigger every turn and draw you cards, that's nuts. This very quickly becomes a sort of win condition that's difficult to deal with, a huge flyer that's also drawing you cards so that you never run out of gas so that you can keep double spelling. In Limited, this is going to be very powerful. It gives you everything you want. It draws you a bunch of cards over the course of the game and gives you a big win condition that you can use to end the game. Even if they get a bigger flyer, you can just wait a couple turns and eventually get it big enough that now yours is bigger again. So I think this card is great in Limited. Not going to be usable whatsoever constructed because it's just too slow. But it's a great card. You know what else is great? Nectar of the Gods. And I need some. Nectar of the Gods. Sweet, sweet nectar. Never gets old. Next up, we have Laughing Jasper Flint. This is a 4/3 legendary lizard rogue for 3 mana in the colors of Rakdos. So pretty decent on-rate body already for being an outlaw too. Creatures you control but don't own are mercenaries in addition to their other types, which means they'll also be outlaws. Important to note. At the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top X cards of target opponent's library, where X is the number of outlaws you control. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among those cards, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. So, first thing worth noting is, this could be a way to play a mill deck, an outlaw tribal mill deck. If you just go wide with outlaws, and you can keep a Laughing Jasper Flint around on the battlefield for a few turns, you can exile a whole bunch of cards off your opponent's library and maybe just win outright with mill. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind when using this. And in fact, if you're in Limited and you get this guy early enough and you get the opportunity to grab him, pack one, pick one, or whatever, you might want to take that into account and possibly even build into that, because with Limited decks only being 40 cards and not 60, it's actually way, way easier to mill your opponent out in Limited and make an archetype like that work. But being able, while you're milling, to get access to value, being able to play their cards, and then when you do, if any of them are creatures, they also count as outlaws when you have them on your side because of the first static ability, which means you'll go even wider with outlaws by playing their stuff even if their stuff isn't an outlaw to begin with, and then you're exiling even more cards. This is just a game-winning engine by itself by just decking them out completely. But even in Constructed, if you're not going to quite do that with him, potentially being able to go wide with Outlaws and use this guy to just get overwhelming value for a turn or two before they're finally able to deal with him could be really awesome by itself. It's going to take a little bit of trial and error and testing out to really see how much work this guy can put in and if he's worth it. But he's definitely worth considering for Outlaw Tribal and maybe even for some kind of a weird, crazy mill deck. I don't know, we'll see. But first pick it in Limited and really try to go into a mill deck because you will win if you do that. Next up we have LAZAV, Familiar Stranger, a 1/4 legendary shapeshifter for 3 mana in the colors of Dimir. Whenever you commit a crime, you put a +1/+1 counter on LAZAV, and then you may exile a card from a graveyard. If it's a creature card, you get to become a copy of it until end of turn. This ability only triggers once though. This happens just for free. Not only are you getting counters for free when you commit a crime, but you get to just become a copy of the best thing in a graveyard. Now, one thing that's worth noting, unlike the other LAZAV, you can only become a copy of that thing that you exiled the turn that you exiled it. The other LAZAV that we got last set, the things that you exile stay in exile. LAZAV remembers them and can, every time it can become a copy of something, it can become a copy of the stuff it previously exiled, which was awesome. But this is just an uncommon, so I wouldn't expect it to be that crazy. The fact that this can get built up with counters, and it's always going to be a better version of whatever you're exiling because it's going to be bigger with the counters, is kind of crazy. Exile their Atali, right? And if this is the third time you've done this, and that's the third +1/+1 counter you're putting on, you've got a 10/10 Atali instead of a 7/7, and you're swinging in for 10, right? With LAZAV immediately, which is nuts. Granted, you're not going to get the ETB trigger because it's just LAZAV becoming a copy of it, but even still, being able to remove their reanimation targets from their graveyard and become a giant stomping threat at the same time, and get bigger forever because of the counters, just seems like a lot. So this is going to be an easy pick in pretty much any Limited deck because it's so easy to commit crimes. It's obviously going to get even better if you're in a deck that's specifically trying to go that direction where you're committing as many crimes as possible for the triggers. But even in Constructed, I think this has an offhand chance of making an appearance. Next up we have Lila, Undefeated Slickshot. This is a 3/3 legendary human rogue with prowess for 3 mana in the colors of Izzet. So 3/3 prowess, already pretty decent. Counts as an outlaw, counts as a human. Both of those creature types matter a lot. Whenever you cast a multicolor instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you get to exile that spell instead of putting it into your graveyard as it resolves. If you do, it becomes plotted. So this is another way of plotting something that shouldn't normally have plot. So there's the obvious way of using it, the way it's intended to be used in a prowess style deck where you're trying to double spell, you're trying to go off and get a bunch of prowess triggers, in which case you're able to effectively double the amount of prowess triggers you get by effectively double the amount of spells you get to cast, because you get to, every spell you cast becomes plotted and gets cast again. So this is just going to be awesome in prowess decks, in any kind of double spell decks. It can just completely snowball value over the course of the game, and you're going to want to play it. But even outside of that, keep in mind the fact that you can plot things that don't have plot means you can set up some busted stuff. And I already talked about this on another card earlier in the video, but you know, being able to plot something like a Bramble Familiar and then play the adventure for free, stuff like that can get really, really crazy and broken. So again, this deserves some experimentation. Pretty much any card that can plot something that doesn't naturally have plot is going to deserve to be experimented with, to find ways of breaking it and casting some of those cards that you shouldn't otherwise be able to cast like way earlier than you normally can. But don't sleep on the fact that this card's just going to be a really good inclusion for the prowess decks either, because Izzet Spellslingers getting so much support, and this is absolutely going to be a thing. Hot Tub Time Machine, anyone? We'll see. Next up we have Loot, the key to everything. This is kind of like the marquee big score card. It's like the big end-all be-all thing that was in the vault that they were trying to get to. This is a 1/2 legendary Beast Noble with Ward 1 for 3 mana in the colors of Temur. So not a great body. It's nice that it has a little bit of like protection from spells with the ward there. It is just Ward 1, but at least it's something. But at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of card types among other non-land permanents you control. You may play those cards this turn. Now on first inspection, I thought, oh, it's like a mini Atraxa. Like maybe you use this in the same deck with Atraxa, and you can do some of what Atraxa is trying to do, but earlier in the game, because it scales with how many different card types, just like Atraxa does. Atraxa can grab 1 card of each type. So both of those decks kind of want to be, or both of those cards rather, kind of want to be in a deck where you have as many different card types as possible, as evenly distributed as possible to get the most value. But then the more I started to think about it, I was like, you don't really need to go super wide with loot. In fact, you probably don't want to go too wide because you're going to be exiling things you probably don't have enough mana to cast. And then you're just like milling yourself super quick. So the more I started to think about loot, the more I realized, wait a minute. Loot just wants to be in a deck that plays things from exile. This is just a way to, for free, every turn, get some stuff into exile to cast for free. So not only, or not for free, but without spending your cards from your hand, right? So not only is it going to give you that card advantage that you normally get from being able to get cards into exile to play, it gets that without spending a card, without using up a card, because it's just loot's trigger that happens every turn. And every time you play that stuff from exile, you can utilize all of the really good payoffs we have right now in Standard as it is for playing stuff from exile, whether it be Rocco Street Chef, or Pia Nalar, or Quintorius, or whatever. You can get some crazy, crazy value off of constantly being able to play things from exile every turn. And in that way, this is almost like a souped up Phyrexian arena that doesn't cost you any life and can get you multiple cards and can trigger all of your exile synergies. And when you start to think of it like that, it's way, way better. Granted, very easy to kill. The War 1 helps a little, but not nearly enough. So I don't think you want to rely on it, but it's definitely nice to be able to cast this in a deck like that, and then maybe one of your other threatening creatures doesn't get the removal spell because they had to use it on loot. So I do think there's potential here. Granted, that deck wants to be 4 colors because there's a lot of white payoff for playing from exile. But I think we can make it work. I honestly think that that could be a thing. So we're going to try and brew that. I think it's the best spot for loot to slot into. But if you have another idea of a way to use loot that I didn't think of, that went over my head, let me know in the comments for sure. Because the potential is so crazy, but the mana requirements, the color requirements specifically, are also kind of nuts. Next up, we have Make Your Own Luck. 5 mana for a sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. 5 mana for a sorcery in the colors of Simic. Blue and green. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may exile a non-land card from among them. If you do, it becomes plotted, and you put the rest into your hand. So, some more plotted shenanigans. What I love about this card, it's only an uncommon. This is one of the best uncommons in the set, in my opinion. It is only an uncommon, and whatever you don't plot still goes to your hand. So this is like a draw 3, and one of those cards you can free cast. Whatever's the most expensive, you can free cast. That's insane for 5 mana, especially for an uncommon when you think about how easy it's going to be to get these in limited, right? Just being able to slam some kind of a bomb for free and still draw another 2 cards as well is just insane value. Like, you need to pick this high if you're anywhere close to Simic and play this in limited for sure, but I would be surprised if this didn't see some kind of play in Constructed. In particular, I have a deck called Hide and Seek, where we're already using like cloak cards to cloak things from the top of our library, and then flicker effects to get like something really big that we cloaked onto the battlefield as its normal version for way, way cheaper, way sooner than we should. And a card like this slots into that perfectly, because not only are we just doing the thing we're normally doing, but now we just get to just plot the big thing that we might hit with cloak and draw more cards that can help us do the rest of the synergies we're trying to do also. Just seems kind of crazy. I don't know. I love this card. play the damn card, because it's not going to table. Next up, we have Malcolm the Eyes. 2 mana for a 2/2 flying haste legendary siren pirate in the colors of Izzet. Full stop. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you also investigate. That's each turn, not each of your turns. So you could second spell on your turn and second spell on your opponent's turn and get 2 clue tokens if you wanted to. Granted, that's a lot, right? You're going to have to be able to cast 4 spells in 1 turn cycle, which probably isn't going to line up very often. But it is possible, especially with plot, right? You could have 2 things plotted and cast them for free on your turn and save up all your mana to cast 2 instant speed spells on your opponent's turn, and you can get a little extra value here. If you have other ways of getting value off second spells, where getting these clue tokens isn't the only reason you want to do that, then it gets even better, because you're also getting these clue tokens and triggering whatever other crazy shenanigans you have going on. But all of that is gravy. The main thing you want to take into account here, and I think the main thing that's overlooked about Malcolm, is it's just a really good aggressive creature. 2/2 flying haste for 2 is super, super on rate. And it counts as an outlaw. It counts as a pirate. Like, I would be surprised if this didn't just see play in some kind of an Izzet aggro deck, maybe an outlaw deck, I don't know. And then just like every now and then you're able to get free clue tokens, just as extra gravy. Like, I don't know, seems pretty good to me. Let me know in the comments if there's specifically a deck that you think would be great for him. Next up, we have Marchesa? I think it's Marchesa. Dealer of Death. This is undoubtedly the best multicolor card in the set. Doubt me if you want. Go ahead, throw all the hate at me. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm absolutely out of my mind. But this card is bananas, and you are all underestimating committing crimes if you don't agree. 3/4 legendary human rogue for only 3 mana in the colors of Grixis. Whenever you commit a crime, you may pay 1. If you do, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. It's so easy to commit crimes, guys. For very cheap, sometimes even free. So much of what you want to be doing in a Grixis control deck is already going to be committing crimes. All of your discard, all of your creature removal, cards that exile stuff from their graveyard, even just, you know, as extra situational whatever. There's so much. Tiny Bones Joins Up. If that card's in play, this comes onto the battlefield and immediately triggers it. Like, there's just so many ways. Like, the number one thing that I think is underestimated about this new set is just how easy it is to commit crimes, and therefore how important all of the good committed crime payoffs are going to be, and how much better they are than I think people will give them credit for at first. But by the end of the first week, you'll know. Everyone will know, because it's going to be bananas. Every single crime you commit, all you do is pay 1, and you get to draw the best of the top 2 cards. The best of the top 2 cards. Just read this as every single turn you get to pay 1 mana and draw the best of the top 2 cards while she's in play. Like, how long does she have to stay in play before that just becomes overwhelming, right? It's just crazy. You can do it multiple times. It's not limited to once a turn. I keep rereading this thinking this has to be one of those cards that triggers only once a turn, right? Nope. Every single time you commit a crime. If you can commit two crimes in a turn for free, you just spend 2 mana and get the best of the top 2 and then the best of the top 2, like, twice in a row. You only spent 2 mana for the turn. You still have the rest of your mana left over for whatever you want. I don't know. This just seems crazy. You can trigger it on your opponent's turn. It counts as a human for human tribal. It counts as an outlaw. It's a pretty decent body. You can't cut it down. You can't lightning helix it. Like, what am I missing? This card's just insane. I don't even have to say anything else. This card is so good. And the only way you don't agree is if you underestimate how easy it is to commit crimes and how often you're going to be committing crimes in the right deck. Obviously, it's not going to be just an auto-include in any deck. You know, you got to be committing crimes. But so many Grixis builds already want to be committing so many crimes. It's just super easy. And when you add that to the fact that there are other really good commit a crime payoffs, and so every time you commit a crime, you're not only getting this, you're also triggering some other stuff probably too, like Gisa or some other crazy stuff we haven't even gone over. Like, it's just insane. Every time you commit a crime, just gain the world. Just gain the world. Marchesa is a slice of that, but it's just going to be super powerful. Don't underestimate it. Build around it. It's going to be a constructed deck, a high, might not be like the tier 1 meta deck, but it is going to be a very important part of the meta, I think, moving forward. It's just too good. It's just too good. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm absolutely whacked out of my mind. Next up, we have Miriam, Herd Whisperer. 2 mana for a 3/2 legendary human druid. It's an uncommon. As long as it's your turn, mounts and vehicles you control have hexproof. That would be good enough on its own. 2 mana 3/2 gives all your mounts and vehicles hexproof on your turn, so your opponent can't mess with your stuff with tricks on your turn. That's awesome. But then it also has, whenever a mount or vehicle you control attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So if you just go super wide with mounts or vehicles, like, everything's getting counters every turn, and your opponent can't just, like, kill their thing in response, kill your thing in response, or kill Miriam in response so that you don't get the value, because hexproof, right? If Miriam's on the ground on turn 2, and it survives the turn cycle, at that point, they're never going to be able to blow you out with a trick the same turn, right? They're going to have to kill Miriam on their turn in order to hold up a trick, and it just, I think it sets them back a lot. So the fact that you can grow your whole board along with that hexproof is kind of insane when you realize it's also a very relevant creature as a 3/2 body for 2. So I just think she's nuts. She's a very high pick. A lot of these multicolor uncommons are just really signpost picks that, like, oh, this card's insane. I ended up getting past this, like, 3rd pick. I have to grab it, and this is the deck I'm gonna play. Like, they're just that good. Not strictly, but you definitely want to keep your mind open to the potential that Miriam can bring you. Mount Tribal is going to be a real thing, guys. I think that's probably the most underestimated deck type right now. I don't think people realize just how crazy Mount Tribal can be, because the mounts can saddle each other if you need to, so you can always swing with just the best mount abilities. It's going to be wild. You'll see. Next up, we have 𝐉𝐵𝐾, Splitter of Seconds. She was so close to being my favorite card of the multicolor cards. Very, very close. She's so awesome. She's so fun. 2/5 legendary Ogre Warlock with Menace for 4 mana in the colors of Grixis. Whenever she deals combat damage to a player, you get that many additional upkeep steps after this phase. So anything that triggers on an upkeep, you're going to get to trigger multiple times, which is already awesome. You got a Virtue of Persistence in play, just get multiple creatures back from the battlefield, onto the battlefield from the graveyard. You know, you got a Phyrexian Arena in play, just draw multiple cards. All that stuff is awesome. But then, you need to think about the other part of this card that I think is a little bit flying under the radar, which is the fact that it gives you a way of getting upkeep triggers the turn that you play something. You don't have to wait an entire turn cycle to come back to the next start of your turn for you to get an upkeep trigger finally. You can play anything that has an upkeep trigger, like, I don't know, Bonehorde Dracosaur, and then swing with 𝐉𝐵𝐾, get upkeeps after combat, and your Bonehorde Dracosaur you played that turn is going to get to trigger a couple times. Like, that's insane. That's so good. That is, not only is it really powerful, but it's really fun. Like, we haven't seen this sort of ability, at least as far as I can remember, and if we have, it's been quite a while. Being able to get additional upkeep steps is awesome as it is. Being able to get an upkeep step later in your turn is awesome as it is, but being able to get both with the same card is awesome, and she even has Menace to sort of partly enable herself to get through to trigger the upkeeps. I just kind of love it, honestly. I can't wait to brew around it. There's so much potential here, and it's going to be so fun. So she is almost my pick. She's definitely second. She's runner-up. That's not an award for me, but she is the runner-up for my, you know, my second favorite card for multicolor for this set. She's just awesome. Next up, we have Oko the Ringleader. No awards, but it is really good. I do think it's even better than people realize. This is 4 mana for a 3 loyalty planeswalker in the colors of Simic At the beginning of combat on your turn, 𝐻𝑒𝐒 the Ringleader becomes a copy of up to one target creature you control until end of turn, except he has hexproof. +1 loyalty, you draw 2 cards, and if you've committed a crime, you get to only discard 1 card, but if you haven't, you have to discard 2 cards. You can -1 to make a 3/3 green elk creature token, and you can -5 for each other non-land permanent you control, create a token that's a copy of that permanent. All of these abilities are awesome, and I think when you're evaluating this card, you need to evaluate it from a different perspectives. I think most people are evaluating this as a Planeswalker. Oh, it's a Planeswalker that requires another decent creature in order for it to be any good. That's a little bit too limiting. I think that's how a lot of people are seeing it. But that's the wrong way of looking at it. What you should look at it as is, oh, this is a 4-mana clone creature that comes in and can become a copy of whatever, except it also has hexproof, and it has loyalty abilities that you can use that turn. At the very least, you get 𝐻𝑒𝐒, a copy of whatever you want it to be that turn, with hexproof, and a 3/3 elk for your 4 mana. That's insane. If you have a haste creature to become a copy of, it gets even crazier, because 𝐻𝑒𝐒 can immediately swing in with the hexproof, right? Before your opponent has any way to deal with it, along with making an elk. And that seems nuts too. But also you have card advantage, you can draw cards if you need to, you can put stuff into your graveyard if you need to fuel anything by doing that. And then the ultimate's awesome too. Even though the static ability kind of almost feels a little bit like an ultimate, he's got an actual ultimate where he just makes a copy of literally everything you control, except for lands. And himself. But doubling your board, if you get to 5 loyalty, also seems kind of crazy. If you have a way of making a copy of 𝐻𝑒𝐒 with like a spark double or something, then you can like use the ultimate and get a 3rd 𝐻𝑒𝐒. And then maybe like use an ultimate. Wait, that's a combo. You could have something like 𝐉𝐸𝑛𝑐𝑒 on the field that doubles the number of counters something enters the battlefield with. And then you could just infinite 𝐻𝑒𝐒, right? Spark double the 𝐻𝑒𝐒 with 𝐉𝐸n𝑐𝑒 out. And then you keep doing the ultimate and keep making copies that are immediately able to ultimate and make copies. And you just keep going. Is that a deck? Is that a thing? Did we just figure out a deck? Let me know in the comments, because that sounds crazy. I can't comprehend it right now. That just popped into my head. We're going to move on. But that's got to be a thing, right? This card's awesome. You just need to evaluate it correctly. It is a clone creature that can have hexproof when you're swinging, and it gives you extra value in the form of loyalty abilities, even just the turn you play it. Next up, we have Pest Control. 2 mana for a sorcery in the colors of Orzhov. This is going to fundamentally change the standard meta. Cycles for 2, which means it's very, very easy to include in any Orzhov deck at very little opportunity cost, because if it's not useful against what you're playing against, you can just cycle it. Or if you just need something else, you can just dig another card deeper for whatever you need. But destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less. This just eats Boros Convoke for breakfast. It eats mono red for breakfast. It kills any of the crazy aggro decks that are just completely demolishing the ladder right now. And aggro's days are numbered because of it. I think this single-handedly gets rid of the Boros Convoke deck. Like, I don't expect to see Boros Convoke on the ladder very much at all moving forward, because it just gets hard countered by this. And I've seen some people argue, well, no, there's some stuff that still leaves behind value. Like, you haven't completely beat them if you pest control, right? They get to keep their War Leader's Call. They get to keep their EOS guy that tutors or whatever, because he's a 4/4. Like, they get to keep some stuff, but it's like, you screw up their tempo so bad, and you end up making a lot of their cards that their card advantage just meaningless, and create things that just went away for just 2 mana. Like, you get so far ahead at that point, it should be easy for the rest of your deck to pretty efficiently and pretty easily deal with whatever this doesn't hit, right? So I think it's going to be a weird case of like, Boros Convoke is big for like the first week, but then this is everywhere, so it absolutely wrecks it, and then it's nowhere, and then people start including this card a little less, and then it starts to come back again, and there's going to be like an ebb and flow to how we see the meta shape up with a card like this in it. It's going to be kind of wild. Next up, we have Pillage the Bog, another really good card. I'm not as high on this as most people, but I do think it's absolutely crazy. 2 mana for a sorcery in the colors of Golgari. It can plot for 3 mana, and you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is twice the number of lands you control. Put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom. So this is effectively a tutor in a ramp deck, right? If you're going wide with lands... Wow, Bo's upset. You grumbly? You don't like the card? Are you worried? Are you worried Dad's gonna lose to the card? Probably. So, for your 2 mana, getting to, like, in a ramp deck, look at the top, like, 14 cards if you have 7 lands in play is kind of nuts. Being able to tutor for your big, like, payoff in a ramp deck is nuts. But even if you're not in a ramp deck, like, you play this on turn 2 with 2 lands out, you still get to look at the top 4. It's effectively a... What's that blue card that looks at the top 4 for 2? I'm drawing a blank for a moment. Let me know in the comments, but it's effectively that, and that's fine as its floor, right? And it just gets better. So I think this is even usable as like a pseudo tutor in other decks that aren't ramp centric. And then if you're in the deck that wants to like double spell or something like that, play a bunch of sorceries, then there's potential for this to fit into that too, because the 2 mana could trigger that kind of stuff, and then you just find another card to do that with as well. Also, the fact that you can plot this means you can play it for free, so it works even better in like a double spell sort of archetype, where you can play it for free and have all of your mana left over to play the thing that you find with it. So, very strong card. I expect it to rear its ugly head in plenty of decks. Next up, we have Rakdos Joins Up. This is one I'm pretty excited about. 5 mana for a legendary enchantment in the colors of Rakdos, obviously. When he joins up, enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, it's a permanent that returns a creature to the battlefield for the same cost as normally a spell that does that, but you also have this permanent left over. That's already kind of like nice, right? For any deck that wants a permanent to do something with, like sacrifice it to something or whatever, beseech the mirror, even if it didn't have the upside, but it has this upside of the creature comes into play with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. Just cause that's crazy. So the creature's a bigger version of what it otherwise would be. Still a 5 mana play, right? But also, while this is on the battlefield, whenever a legendary creature you control dies, Rakdos Joins Up deals damage equal to that creature's power to target opponent. So it's like every legendary creature is a fling without having to cast fling. Am I reading this wrong? Like, this is insane. Your 5 mana does the normal 5 mana thing of reanimating a thing, except it's bigger, and then every legendary is an automatic fling. It's just crazy. This is crazy. We have to brew around this. There is absolutely a deck that's going to abuse the hell out of this. Imagine using this with Yargle and Multani. Brings back an 18 power creature, gives it 2 counters, so that's a 20 power creature. Literally, all you need is any sacrifice outlet, and it's 20 damage to their head. That's going way over the top with it, but even if you don't use it like that, there's just tons of value just baked into this card, pretty much in any Legendary Matters deck. Like, I expect it to see a lot of play. Card's insane. The one knock against it is that there's so much graveyard hate coming that I don't know if a Reanimator deck can actually be a thing in Standard moving forward. We'll have to see. But if it is, you better believe this card will be there. Speaking of Rakdos, Rakdos the Muscle. 5 mana for a 6/5 legendary demon mercenary with flying and trample in the colors of Rakdos. Whenever you sack another creature, you exile cards equal to its mana value from the top of target player's library. So, if you sack a creature, it is a free way to commit a crime. Don't overlook that. Until your next end step, you may play those cards, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. Also, you can sack a creature to have Rakdos the Muscle gain indestructible until end of turn, but you can only activate this once a turn, and if you do it, you have to tap it. So, what's important to note is you can swing with this and then use the sack ability, and it doesn't matter that it's already tapped. That ability that taps it is not a cost. It's just making sure that you can't give this indestructible and then afterwards still hold it up as a blocker after you say go, right? That's the main thing. So your opponent can use instant speed removal on it, force you to have to activate the ability, and it becomes tapped so that it's not untapped to block their thing when they untap and take their turn. So, if you're in any kind of a go-wide sack deck, there's just automatic value with this guy on top of a body that's already really good on rate. And, yeah, it does the damn thing. And it has a built-in way to protect itself, and it just seems kind of perfect. Will this see play in crime decks, where you're trying to commit crimes because it incidentally is able to commit crimes? If there is some kind of way to cross-pollinate the synergies of decks that want to commit crimes and go wide sacrifice decks, you better believe this will be a part of that deck. But I could see it being a reasonable part of either right now, to be honest. Next up, we have Riku of Many Paths. 3 mana for a 3/3 legendary human wizard in the colors of 𝑇𝑒𝑟𝑟. Whenever you cast a modal spell, you choose up to X, where X is the number of times you chose a mode for that spell. It's interesting that they use the word modal spell as part of the rules text, because I don't think that's ever appeared on a card before. We've always referred to them as modal spells, but I don't think they've ever officially been referred to as a modal spell in the text of a card. So it's kind of interesting. But you get to pick one of these whenever you choose a mode for a spell. Exile the top card of your library, and you get to play it until your next turn, or until the end of your next turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on Riku of Many Paths, and give it trample until end of turn, or create a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying. Now this is already going to be really good on things like Charms, where you get to choose a mode, but it's even better on things like Spree, where you get to choose multiple modes. And there's a couple cards from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. One of them's a Rakdos card, and one of them's a Dimir card, which under the right circumstances you get to choose multiple modes off those without paying any extra mana. So it's kind of like Spree, but without having to pay mana for still 2 mana, very, very cheap. Those cards with this could be nuts, because those could be really, really cheap ways under the right condition to trigger all 3 of these abilities. Yeah. Just crazy. Has to be in the right deck to get the payoff for sure, and I don't know if that deck is good enough to compete in the standard meta, but if it is, then it'll be a deck, and this will be a part of it, and it'll do the damn thing. Next up, we have Roxanne, Starfall Savant. Flavorfully, one of my favorite cards in the set, flavor-wise. So it's a 4/3 legendary cat druid for 5 mana in the colors of Gruul. I'm normally not much of a Gruul player, but when Roxanne Starfall Savant enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to create a tapped colorless artifact token named Meteorite that deals 2 damage to any target when it enters and can tap for a mana of any color. And as if that wasn't enough, she has a static ability that whenever you tap an artifact for mana, you add 1 mana of any type that artifact token produced. She just kind of does all the cool things. Like, Meteorite is such a cool card to begin with, but it's way too overcosted at 5 mana. This effectively is the same amount of mana it costs to just cast Meteorite, except you also have Roxanne. You get the Meteorite for free, and then whenever she swings, you get to make more Meteorites. I just kind of love that. It's like a meteor shower on a stick. Just thematically, it's so cool. The idea of having all these Meteorites to use, just awesome. Like I said, I've always loved Meteorite as a card, but it's just been too expensive to ever really see play in any of my decks, even in Limited. But this is a way of being able to play with Meteorites. It's totally worth it. And then on top of that, you just get to double all of your mana that the Meteorites make. You get to double all of the mana that your treasures make. So on and so forth. I think this card is super fun. I really want to brew around it. Obviously, there are only very specific decks that are going to take advantage of it, but we got to make something. We got to make something with her because she seems just so fun. Can we play this in like Cat Tribal and use like Roaming Throne so that we get multiple Meteorites? I don't know, maybe. Are there other ways we can double up on the triggers? Let me know in the comments. There's got to be a cool deck we can put this into, so I'm really interested to know if you can think of something, so let me know. Next up, we have Ruthless Lawbringer. This was very close to being my best limited pick. 3-2 for a Vampire Assassin, a 3-2 Vampire Assassin for 3 mana in the colors of Orzhov. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack another creature, and if you do, you destroy target non-land permanent. This is just a lot of value. Getting your destroy any permanent by sacrificing your worst thing ability on a stick, on a 3-2 body for 3 is awesome. Not only because you also have a body to contend with their board, but you can flicker the thing and reuse the ability, or you can use scam style abilities. You can have it come back into play and get to do it all over again. And that just seems really great, on top of the fact that it's a vampire for Vampire Tribal. It's an assassin for both Assassin Tribal and Outlaw Tribal. I just think there's a lot of cool ways to use this card, and at the very, very floor, it's just a way to have a piece of removal in your deck to deal with literally any non-land permanent, even if, you know, even if you can't find ways of getting all of the extra value out of it. Just having a card that's an uncommon that you can pick up relatively easily, that's going to let you destroy any non-land permanent and be really good, efficient removal, is going to be really important. So I think this card is awesome. Pick it high. Play with it. Next up, we have Satoru, the Infiltrator. This card's awesome. A 2-3 legendary human ninja rogue with menace for 2 mana in the colors of Dimir. Whenever Satoru the Infiltrator and or 1 or more non-token creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if none of them were cast or no mana was spent to cast them, you draw a card. This works with so much stuff. First of all, obviously it works with ninjutsu. Playing any kind of ninjutsu deck, every time you ninjutsu something into play, you're going to get to draw a card. But playing anything from exile by exiling stuff to be able to play it and be played until end of turn, stuff like that, also going to trigger this. Anything with plot, you plot it. When you play it from plot, it's also going to trigger this. I think the most overlooked way of triggering this is the one I'm the most excited about, which is just flickering things. If you flicker things, even just flicker Satoru himself, you get to draw cards every time you flicker. You're turning all of your flicker spells and abilities into free cantrips as well, which is crazy. If you're getting the ETB trigger of a thing you flickered, but then also drawing a card because Satoru's in play, that just seems awesome. I want to build that deck, for sure. But then you add in the fact that it's human for human tribal, it's a ninja for ninja tribal, it's a rogue, so it counts as an outlaw for outlaw super tribal. This card just does everything you want, and it's already got a great body. A 2-3 menace for 2 is already really good. And no, I didn't mean that in the inappropriate way. Although, I'm not saying you don't have a great body, Satoru, because clearly you're a man who knows what he wants, and you're in shape. But I digress. The card is awesome. Play with the card. Next up, we have Selvala, Eager Trailblazer. 4 mana for a 4/5 legendary elf scout with vigilance. This is not an outlaw, keep that in mind. It's in the colors of Selesnya. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you get to make a mercenary, so it does make outlaws, which means it's probably worth using in an outlaw tribal deck. And obviously those mercenaries can tap to give something +1 attack at sorcery speed until end of turn. But then you can also tap Selvala and choose a color and add a mana of that color for each different power among creatures you control. So the obvious way to use this best is to include it with as many go wide mercenary token creating cards as possible, because the mercenary tokens are able to tap and distribute +1 power buffs to however you need to in order to help you get to as many different powers as possible so that you can get the absolute max mana out of tapping Selvala. So there's some really cool synergy there, and then you can just play even more spells with the mana you get from Selvala, and it can just get kind of crazy. So I think this card is really cool. The fact that you can swing in with Selvala first with Vigilance before you tap it for mana. You could tap it for mana in the middle of combat while you're swinging with Selvala. Use that mana to blow them out with combat tricks. So many cool things you can do. So I love Selvala. It's definitely a bomb. slam it in limited for sure. But man, I really want to try to build around this with Mercenary Tribal, maybe even just Outlaw Tribal as a whole, and see what kind of ridiculous banana crazy stuff we can get up to. Next up, we have Seraphic Steed. I love this card. This is one of the reasons why I think Mount Tribal is going to be a real thing. It is a 2/2 Unicorn Mount with First Strike and Lifelink for 2 mana. So, full stop. That by itself is amazing. That is so good. It's not legendary. It is effectively a White Knight, except instead of protection from black, it's got lifelink, which is fine. But it also saddles for 4, which granted is a lot, but if you attack with it while saddled, you make a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying, and I absolutely love that. It can attack somewhat protected because of the First Strike, which is pretty awesome. But there's so many ways to just abuse this card. First of all, if you're in Mount Tribal going wide, you can do things like choose which mount is going to saddle which other mount, so that if certain mounts can't safely attack in without getting eaten up by your opponent's creatures, you can just use them to saddle the other mounts that can swing in effectively. So that's a cool way of getting over the downsides that come along with something like this once they start to have bigger creatures on their side. But also, if you play this with like Roaming Throne, it's awesome because you can get double trigger, make 2 3/3 flyers, but it's even better with Delny. Yes, this is perfect with Delny. Mount Tribal with Delny, let's go, because normally it being 2 power only would be a detriment. But because this is 2 power, now this can basically swing in unblockable. The only things that can block it are usually going to be the things that you can kill with First Strike that won't kill your Seraphic Steed. And not only is it getting through unblockable with a Delny, but you're getting double triggers and making the 2 3/3 flying angel tokens. You could get even more if you have Delny and Roaming Throne. Mount Tribal's going to be real. There's going to be a super deep version of Mount Tribal that uses Roaming Throne, and then there's going to be a not quite as deep version of Mount Tribal that uses Delny, I think, and uses some more creatures that aren't super deep into Mount. I'm brewing a bunch of stuff right now. Deck's going to be nuts, though. I'm telling you. Mount Tribal's probably the one thing that no one else is really thinking of. None of the content creators. I know mounts kind of seem a little bit too cute right now. And sort of memey a little bit. And people are viewing them as like certain mounts situationally might see a little play here or a little play there. But I don't think anyone's taking actual Mount Tribal seriously. I don't think anyone's even come up with the idea yet. But you better believe I'm going to do it, because that deck's going to be insane. Moving on. Slick Sequence. Talk about insane. 2 mana for an instant. In the colors of Izzet. It deals 2 damage to any target, and if you've cast another spell this turn, you draw a card. So it's almost like you get your Opt and your Shock on the same card for the same amount of mana, still at instant speed. That's crazy. Granted, you don't get to scry at all, right? And granted, you have this hoop of jumping through where you have to double spell in order to draw the card. But if you do, it's just like you got an Opt and a Shock, but you only had to spend 1 card, not 2. And that's huge. And obviously, you're not going to use this in a deck unless you're able to double spell often, and you can get that value off of it. But in any kind of like a Izzet Spell Slinger deck, Prowess Trigger deck, where you're going to be double spelling a lot, this is just an auto-occlude. It's just awesome. It's just getting your Shock and your Opt without having to spend 2 cards. And that's just perfect. It can still hit their head to close out a game if you need to. Like, the biggest problem that those Spellslinger decks tend to have is that they run out of gas before they can quite get there. So, if you have just that one more card that can draw you into one more card that can maybe be the reason you got there in time, that makes all the difference in the world. So, I think this is going to be a very important card in Constructed for those Spellslinger decks, especially if those Spellslinger decks finally end up being good enough to actually see a decent amount of play in the meta. But also, this is a no-brainer in Limited, right? It's a removal spell, and in Limited, you can just wait until you have enough mana to cast 2 spells, probably, so that you do get to draw the card. So, slam dunk either way. Next up, we have Tai Joaquin. Perfect Shot. this is my pick for the sleeper card in multicolor for this set. Granted, some people realize how good this is. This isn't like a sleeper to everybody, but I still think most of the community doesn't realize how insane this card can be. This is a 2/3 legendary human mercenary for only 2 mana in the colors of Boros, so it's already an above rate body. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to a creature equal to that creature's toughness, you draw a card. So if you do 𝐻𝐔𝐍's amount of damage to kill the thing, you draw a card. You don't have to spend any mana. That's what makes that ability crazy. You just have to do the right amount of damage and you draw a card. All of your removal spells become cantrips. All of your damage removal spells become cantrips as long as you do exactly the right amount of damage. And then its second ability helps you achieve that. You can pay X, tap 𝐻𝑒𝑐𝐻, and if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player this turn, it deals that much damage plus X instead. The important thing to note here is this doesn't target just one thing, and it doesn't just work with one source. This deals extra X damage for every source of yours that deals non-combat damage that turn, to every single thing that those sources hit that turn. So it's exponential damage. It's insane. If you play 2 wedding festivities or end the festivities in the same turn, both of them are a 1 mana spell that deals 1 damage to everything, including the opponent and their planeswalkers and their creatures, but only on their side, not yours, right? If you play 2 of those, say you have 5 mana out, you play 2 of those in the same turn, and then you pay 3 and tap 𝐻𝑒𝑐𝐻, each end the festivities is gonna deal an extra 3 damage to everything it hits. So that means their entire board is taking 8 damage total. They're taking 8 damage to the head. Their planeswalkers are taking 8 damage. Like, that's insane. If you have any ways to make things take damage without spending mana, it gets utterly absurd. Utterly absurd. If you have like a what is that card called? The lizard, the adventure lizard. The Izzet adventure lizard that when it's in play, they get pinged for 1 damage if they play a 3-drop or less. You have that in play, you have 𝐻𝑒𝑐𝐻. They try to play a 3-drop. In response, you tap the 𝐻𝑒𝑐𝐻 and put all your mana into it. Now, say you had 5 mana, they're going to take 6 damage off of playing that spell from the lizard. And then if they play anything else that turn, they'll take another 6 and another 6. So they can't even play anything else the rest of the turn. Like, there's so many ways for this card to just be crazy. Sure, she has to survive and she dies to removal. Sure, you have to have certain cards to combo it with, right? But you can, and she's nuts. Not only that, she's an easy way to complete battles. I totally am going to make a new battle deck. I love battles. I have a really awesome battle deck that does super, super well, that it's been so long since we've gotten battles that I think people have kind of forgot exist. But you can just use this to complete a battle. Like, all you have to do is just ping a battle for 1 damage in any way, shape, or form, and then you just do whatever the rest of the damage you need to do to complete the battle. You can just pay that mana and complete the battle. She turns every single one of your direct damage spells into an automatic complete a battle, as long as she's, you know, available to use and you have the mana. So that's another cool way to use her. I just think she's awesome. There's so many potential ways to like really break this card if it's used in conjunction with just the right spells. So I'm going to be brewing my head off to try and make it happen. She's awesome. She's my best pick for sleeper in multicolor in this set. Next up, we have the Gitrog Ravenous Ride, a 6/5 legendary frog horror mount with trample and haste for 5 mana in the colors of Golgari. Whenever the Gitrog deals combat damage to a player, you can sack a creature that saddled it. If you do, you get to draw X cards and put up to X lands from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, where X is the sacrifice creature's power, and it saddles for just 1. So you want to saddle it with something that's somewhat high power, right? Because the higher the power, the more cards you draw, and the more lands that you get to ramp out with. But it's nice that you can just saddle it with a 1/1. you know, you can just saddle it with a 1/1, sack your little 1/1 token, draw a card, ramp out a land. And that's fine. You're also swinging with a 6/5 trample haste that only costs you 5 mana. So getting to do that every single turn and just sack the creature that's best to sack on that specific turn, depending on what you're trying to do, you could ramp out super fast, refill your hand while you're doing it so you have stuff to use all that ramp for. It's a lot of power. Now, if we can find the best way of creating power that we can sack with minimal loss, because we don't want to sack a big creature that we would want to stick around on the battlefield because it's a big creature, right? So I'm going to challenge myself to try to find a way to figure out high power creature that we're going to want to sacrifice. Usually the best way to do that is maybe something that needs to be sacrificed at end of turn anyway. Cards that let you get creatures back or generate creature tokens that have to be sacrificed at end of turn. We can probably abuse some of those synergies with the Gitrog here by getting even more value off of things that we're probably going to lose anyway. So we're going to look into that. I'm going to see if there's a way to brew something that really takes this guy over the top. But if you have any ideas about like the best ways to utilize this, definitely let me know in a comment, because we're going to do it. Next up we have Vile Smasher, Gleeful Grenadier. This is a 3/2 legendary Goblin Mercenary, so Goblin Tribal and Outlaw Tribal. Whenever another Outlaw enters the battlefield under your control, Vile Smasher Gleeful Grenadier deals 1 damage to target opponent. This is kind of awesome. You could play this in Outlaw Tribal. If you're going wide, especially with Mercenary tokens, you're just constantly pinging them. When this is on the battlefield, you don't even need to really find a way to break it. It's on the battlefield, cool. For the rest of the game, every single creature that I play is going to ping you for 1. Like, that's good in and of itself, but obviously if you have a way to go super wide exponentially, it gets even better. But if you have something like a Roaming Throne, or anything that can, you know, get double triggers, like that Joins Up enchantment we saw earlier in this video, you could get some really, really cool stuff going by doing 2 every time. There's just a lot of potential here. I kind of love this. Outlaw Tribal, it's going to be a thing. Grab this guy super high if you get him in limited, and just go into Outlaw Tribal, and it'll be super fun and awesome. Next up we have Vraska Joins Up. 2 mana for a legendary enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you put a death touch counter on each creature you control. And then whenever a legendary creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This card's bananas. It's like a 2 mana Gix, except it's an enchantment, so it's harder to remove. And it gives you some immediate value when it hits the board. That's just insane. Like, all of your legendary creatures getting to draw you cards whenever they connect, you're going to gas up so easy. And then the fact that you get death touch counters on everything, it doesn't even need to be a legendary creature, is kind of nuts. You could play this with legendary creatures that make non-legendary tokens, like Adeline or Ainam Pakal or something like that. And then, like, all of your legends are able to draw cards when they connect, but you're getting all these tokens that you can then play this and put death touch counters on all of them, so that all of your tokens become relevant threats. Easy way to chump block your opponent's best creatures and just kill them with the death touch. Like, there's so many cool ways you can line things up with this card. Slam dunk. It might replace Gix in some builds, to be completely honest. Speaking of Vraska, here we have Vraska the Silencer. I'm pretty stoked about this card. 3/3 legendary Gorgon Assassin, so it does count as an outlaw. For 3 mana in the colors of Golgari, it has death touch. Whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, you may pay 1. If you do, you return that card to the battlefield tapped under your control. It becomes a treasure artifact that can tap and sack for any mana, any color of mana, and it loses all other card types. The most important thing to note about this card is that when you get those treasure copies of things that die, it only loses all other card types, not abilities. So even though it won't be a creature anymore, it won't be something you can attack and block with, any abilities that it has, you're still going to have. If you kill their Sheoldred, you get to pay 1 and get a copy of Sheoldred that's a treasure. It's not a creature, but every turn it's, every time you draw, you're still going to gain 2 life. Every time they draw, they're still going to lose 2 life. You can do that for every creature you kill if you just have an extra mana available. if you kill a Brutal Cathar, the treasure comes into play tapped and has the ability to exile something when it came into play. So as long as you never sack the treasure, you exile another threat of theirs and it stays exiled. Like, there's so much potential with this card. I think this is the one card that is better than people realize, because you really have to play with it and see what it can do. Like, all of the ways that this is generating value is not by lining up with stuff that you're including within your deck to synergize with it. It's all based on what kind of abilities the creatures have, of the abilities of the creature decks that you're up against. So you're going to have to play this more and more against more different kinds of decks before you really start to realize how good it is and how much value you can get consistently on average. And I do think that end result's going to be a lot. I think the answer is going to be a lot, but I think most people don't realize the potential of this card because it requires playing with it and playing against other decks just to see how good it is. But it's definitely great. Next up, we have Wrangler of the Damned. 5 mana for a 1/4 human soldier with flash while my dog is snoring. It is in the colors of Azorius. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, you make a 2/2 flyer. That's kinda crazy. First of all, you can flash it in, which means if you have other payoffs that trigger from not playing spells from your hand, you can wait to play this on their turn so that you can still get those payoffs on your turn. So this, like, really just helps you go super deep into the we're going to get value off not playing things from our hand on our turn. So any kind of plot stuff, so that you're not playing the thing from your hand, you're only plotting it from your hand and then playing it from exile, not your hand, so that you can get your, 2/2 flyers off this, are going to be great. Obviously, anything in like the Flash Tribal archetype where you are playing as much stuff as Flash so you can play it on their turn so that you can get these triggers every turn. If you're drawing cards, making 2/2 flyers, stacking up the value that you're getting from not casting spells from your hand on your turn, and then you have all of these ways to enable it, it can just end up generating overwhelming value over time. So I think this is kind of awesome. Probably not as good as some of the other like signpost multicolor uncommons we've seen, because it does require a little bit more finesse to build into the right archetype to really get the most out of this. But in that deck, if you build it correctly, this card is going to be insanely powerful, and it's not going to take too many turns before you have an overwhelming amount of evasive threats that can just close out the game. So I would probably pick it kind of high. Probably not as high as some of the other signposts, but still pretty high. It does take a lot more of a commitment to get into just the right deck where this is going to see the most value for you. And then the last multicolor card, finally, the last card of our entire set review, Wily Duke, a teen hero. Atin? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. This is a 4/2 legendary human ranger for 3 mana in the colors of Selesnya, has vigilance, and whenever he becomes tapped, you get to gain a life and draw a card. This is good in so many different ways. Like, obviously, you can just use it with saddle, right? The art makes it pretty obvious. Whenever you saddle a creature with Wily Duke, you're going to get to gain a life and draw a card, get a little bit of extra value there, which is nice. But you can also swing with Wily Duke with vigilance, and then tap him some other way after combat or on your opponent's turn to get value off of him still. You could swing for 4 on your opponent's turn, block, and then tap him for something else. So that could be really cool. You could also use him with something like Halo Fountain, so that you can tap him for something, and then untap him and get even more value, and then tap him again and get even more value. I like that vigilance here is almost being used as a downside, but if you're able to synergize just right and build around it just right, you can still use it as an upside if you have other ways to tap. Just a lot of cool stuff going on with this card. It's going to be really fun experimenting with him. I don't really expect him to be quite good enough at the end of the day to be constructed worthy, but the potential's there. There's a possibility. So I think we're going to mess around, and we're going to see just what Wily Duke can get up to, and see if it's good enough. Halo Fountain, I think, might be a key part of trying to get to the full extent of Wily Duke's potential. But that's it. That's our entire set review for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Finally, it was a lot of work. The one thing that was my takeaway from doing that with this set is I think the next time we do a set review and spoilers, instead of spoiling every single card that comes out on the day they're spoiled, and then also doing these set reviews broken down by color once all of the cards have been spoiled, I think we're still going to do that, but I think those initial spoiler videos, I'm only going to spoil the rares and mythics, and then maybe use the coffee break as a way to just quickly point out like the best couple uncommons that might be constructed worthy or whatever for the day. But I think going over all of the commons and the uncommons twice, once on the day that they're dropped in the spoiler video that I make, and again in the set review, is a little overkill. So moving forward, that is a change I'm going to make, I think. With the spoiler videos, it's going to be all of the rares and mythics with a couple key uncommons in the coffee break. And then the set reviews, it's going to be the only time that I actually review all of the commons and uncommons, along with, you know, updated thoughts on where I'm at with all of the rares and mythics still, for people that aren't checking out the initial spoiler videos. So I hate to ramble on about all that, but I'm figuring out as I go. Every time a new set comes out, I'm figuring out a little more how better to do things for the channel and to bring stuff to you. So I think that's what I'm going to do moving forward. But I appreciate you sticking till the end. If you actually sat through the end and all of that rambling I just did, let me know in a comment below. Say something like, yo, I'm still here, so that I know you're one of those real ones that stuck it out all the way to the end, because I appreciate you guys for watching the whole video. It does help out my algorithm so much. If you haven't liked already, like the video, because I need every single like so that this can get out to more people, can help the channel grow. And subscribe if you're new. Tons of content on the way. The decks that we're going to hit the ground running with are insane. We're going to have a new deck tech upload every single day for like the first 2 or 3 weeks. Insane deck ideas coming. So look forward to that. This has been my set review for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you soon. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.